And I do believe that the rule of law, as we're talking about, is in the kind of the broadest sense. And the International Bar Association in 2005 set down its principle on what the rule of law is. And I just want to set those points, because when you think about these points, you begin to think about what's going to be needed during this transformational system. An independent, impartial judiciary is what is required. The presumption of innocence, the right to a fair and public trial, a rational and proportionate approach to punishment, a strong and independent legal profession, as I've described, and equality of all before the law. These are your principles, at least from the perspective of the International Bar Association, that must be as the foundation for a country that's going through a constitutional change and democratization. The constitutional drafting, which was, it's hard because you have Palos here, who is a giant in this field. But it was alluded to this morning about the challenges, and I think one of the questions was, well, when you're facing this new environment, what do you do with the existing Constitution that has really never been implemented? Do you embrace that? Do you start again? Do you alter it? Do you amend it? And whatever you do, how do you do it? Palos had mentioned the idea of a national conference or a people's congress. I very much like that idea. The experience that I've had in the fall of the Berlin Wall after 1989, involving when I was overseeing the ABA Sealy program, was this exact issue. The inundation of countries that needed first and foremost to have this Constitution as its foundation. You have to have that. That's the vision, that's the passion that you have as a people and as a country. But how do you go about doing that? And is it an open process? Is it something that's a bit more closed? That's something that's going to have to be decided, but I would certainly encourage a much more open process as has been described. I would also encourage that there are international experts that are involved, not in the process of drafting or even making any involvement with any type of provisions, but it brings credibility. That's the key. For us after 1989, with working in about 20 countries, it was the drafting committees that went through this process. But the fact that we had international experts around the table so that the drafters could seek questions, could ask clarifications on what exists in other countries was really quite remarkable. And at the end, it was their constitution. But it did provide, I think, a degree of credibility that you had international support for it. That's a decision that you will have to make, but from my experience, it worked well. And finally, as I said at the beginning in the rule of law, the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary does not exist now in the country, and it has to exist. That has to be a fundamental focus in the transformation. Constitutionalism does not exist without an independent judiciary. And the reality is, not only in many African countries, but in many developed countries, this is a real challenge to truly have a judiciary that is seen as independent. It's a long-term process, but it has to be started at the very beginning. And lastly, I'll finish my remarks by talking briefly on accountability. Accountability is an issue that I think is faced today more than any other time. It's this peace versus accountability kind of debate. But those who have committed gross violations of international law, international humanitarian law, in my opinion, must be brought to justice. Over the last century, it is no longer the role of the state to make that determination on who is brought to justice and who is brought to account. International law has now emerged with firm principles that impunity for the gross violations of international humanitarian law is no longer permissible. And so today the interpretation of international law is such that it recognizes the actors and entities and citizens that have a legitimate right for accountability and for justice. And this is something that will have to be debated, but the recognition that is no longer in the purview of the government to grant impunity is now absolutely steadfast. We know that the UN Commission of Inquiry in 2016 made a recommendation, first found the crimes against humanity had occurred in the country, but most importantly, made a recommendation that an international tribunal, perhaps the International Criminal Court, needs to be involved. Whatever the process is, I only tell you this, that to go forward and to ignore the issue of accountability, in my opinion, would be a real tragedy. It is not without challenges of trying to create this peaceful existence and moving to a transformation where you're beginning to have a solid base of the rule of law. But the rule of law cannot exist without the accountability. You owe it to victims to ensure that justice is done. And that is something where I think the international community, and for that matter, the International Bar Association, is ready and willing to assist on this. Thank you very much.